The boy's service dog lunged toward seat 12F with a ferocity no one had ever seen before. The animal's lips curled back, exposing teeth that gleamed under the cabin lights, and a guttural snarl tore from its throat that made every passenger within 3 rows freeze in their seats. The flight attendant dropped her clipboard. A woman gasped. The man in 12F pressed himself against the window, his face drained of all color, and for a moment, just one terrible suspended moment, everyone on that plane understood that something was catastrophically wrong. What they would discover in the next hour would not only save lives, but would expose a truth so dark, so carefully hidden, that even seasoned investigators would struggle to believe it. But first, we need to go back. Back to when this was just another Tuesday morning, and a young boy named Marcus was simply trying to get home. Marcus wheeled himself through the automatic doors of Denver International Airport at 6:47 in the morning, his mother pushing his chair from behind, while his service dog, a 3-year-old German shepherd named Apollo, walked steadily at his left side. The terminal was already alive with the controlled chaos of early morning travel. Businessmen in rumpled suits clutching coffee cups like lifelines, families corralling sleepy children, the electronic voice announcing gates and delays in that peculiar tone that managed to sound both urgent and completely indifferent. Marcus had made this journey before. At 13 years old, he'd become something of an expert at navigating airports, at fielding the stares that lingered too long on his wheelchair, at answering the inevitable questions about Apollo with a patience that sometimes made his mother's heart ache. The cerebral palsy that had stolen the easy use of his legs had never touched his mind, never dulled the sharp intelligence in his eyes or the quick smile that could light up his entire face. And Apollo was more than just a service dog. He was a guardian, a companion, a bridge between Marcus and a world that wasn't always built for him. They moved through security with the practiced efficiency of frequent travelers. Marcus transferred to the airport wheelchair while Apollo waited, perfectly still, as the TSA agent ran a hand over his vest and checked his certification papers. The dog's dark eyes remained fixed on Marcus throughout the entire process, that unwavering focus that all truly exceptional service animals possess. His mother, Jennifer, collected their belongings from the conveyor belt, mentally running through her checklist: tickets, boarding passes, Marcus's medication in the carry-on, Apollo's water bottle, emergency contact information. Everything accounted for, everything normal. They had a 3-hour flight ahead of them back to Portland, back home after a week visiting Jennifer's sister in Boulder. Marcus was tired. She could see it in the slight slump of his shoulders, the way he leaned more heavily into his chair, but he was smiling, talking about the mountain views he'd seen, about the planetarium they'd visited, about how Apollo had charmed every single person they'd met. Jennifer listened, responded, guided them toward Gate B-17, and never once suspected that in less than an hour her son's life would hang in a balance so precarious that one wrong move could shatter everything. Gate B-17 was moderately crowded when they arrived. Jennifer parked Marcus's wheelchair near the charging station, helped him plug in his tablet, and settled into the seat beside him while Apollo curled at his feet. The dog's presence created a small bubble of space around them. Some people edged away, uncomfortable or allergic or simply uncertain how to behave around a working service animal, while others smiled warmly or asked permission to say hello. Marcus handled both reactions with equal grace, explaining when asked that Apollo was trained to detect the onset of his seizures, that the dog could sense changes in his body chemistry minutes before Marcus himself felt anything wrong, giving them crucial time to get to safety. It was a speech he'd given 100 times, and he delivered it with the matter-of-fact tone of someone describing the weather. Apollo, for his part, accepted gentle pats from children with infinite patience, remained unmoved by the adults who cooed and fussed, and kept one ear always angled toward Marcus, listening for the subtle shifts in breathing or movement that might signal danger. This was his job. This was his entire world. And nothing, not treats, not affection, not the most enticing distraction, could pull him from it. The boarding call came at 7:32. Jennifer began gathering their things, while Marcus powered down his tablet and tucked it into his backpack. They joined the line during the pre-boarding call, the announcement inviting passengers with disabilities or those needing extra time. It was a courtesy Marcus appreciated even as he hated needing it, that complicated tangle of gratitude and frustration that came with being 13 and dependent in ways his peers weren't. They moved down the jetway slowly, Apollo's nails clicking softly against the ribbed metal floor, the air growing warmer and more close as they approached the plane. The flight attendant waiting at the aircraft door had the practiced smile of someone who'd greeted 10,000 passengers, but it softened into something more genuine when she saw Marcus and Apollo. She confirmed their seat numbers, row 8, aisle seat for accessibility, and waved them through. Jennifer collapsed the wheelchair, handed it off to be gate-checked, and helped Marcus navigate the narrow aisle to their row. Other passengers were still boarding, stuffing bags into overhead compartments, settling into seats, doing that peculiar dance of polite space negotiation that happens when strangers are about to spend hours pressed together in a metal tube, hurtling through the sky. Apollo waited until Marcus was settled, then positioned himself in the floor space at his feet, lying down with his head resting on his paws, but his eyes open, alert, watching. Across the aisle and 3 rows back, the man who would later occupy seat 12F was just boarding the plane. He was unremarkable at first glance, mid-40s, average height, thinning brown hair, wearing jeans and a gray pullover that had seen better days. He carried a single backpack slung over one shoulder and moved with the efficient purpose of a solo traveler who knew the routine. He found his seat, stowed his bag, and settled in by the window, barely acknowledging the elderly woman who would be sitting in the middle seat, or the businessman who took the aisle. He pulled out his phone, appeared to be reading something, and to every casual observer he was just another passenger on just another flight. But he wasn't, not even remotely. And Apollo knew it the moment the man walked past their row. The dog's head had lifted slightly, his nostrils flaring as he caught a scent carried on the recycled air of the cabin. His ears swiveled forward, targeting something, and for just a fraction of a second his body tensed. Marcus felt it immediately, that subtle shift in Apollo's posture that he'd learned to read like a language. He glanced down, saw the dog's gaze fixed intently toward the back of the plane, and felt a small flutter of concern in his chest. But then Apollo relaxed again, settling back down, and Marcus dismissed it. Maybe someone had food in their bag. Maybe another animal's scent was lingering on a passenger's clothes. Apollo was trained, yes, but he was still a dog, still capable of momentary distractions. Marcus leaned his head back against the seat, watched the last few passengers file past, and thought nothing more of it. That small dismissal, that single moment of assuming everything was fine, would haunt him later. because Apollo hadn't been distracted. Apollo had been working, and what he'd detected in that fraction of a second would prove to be the difference between life and death. The cabin door sealed shut with that heavy, final thunk that always made Jennifer's stomach tighten slightly. She wasn't afraid of flying exactly, but she'd never loved it either. The lack of control, the forced stillness, the way turbulence could send her heart into her throat, no matter how many times the pilot's calm voice assured them it was perfectly normal. She buckled her seatbelt, checked that Marcus had done the same, and tried to settle into the mindset of 3 hours suspended in air. The flight attendants moved through their safety demonstration with choreographed precision. Exits here and here. Oxygen masks will drop from overhead in the event of a water landing. Jennifer had heard it so many times the words had become white noise, but she watched anyway, superstition making her feel like ignoring the safety briefing might somehow jinx the flight. Beside her, Marcus was already lost in his tablet again, earbuds in, that particular expression of peaceful absorption that meant he'd found a video or game that interested him. And at their feet, Apollo lay perfectly still, the model of a well-trained service animal, except his eyes hadn't closed, not once, and they kept drifting back toward row 12, back toward the man by the window, who was now staring blankly out at the tarmac, waiting for takeoff. The plane began to taxi at 7:51. The engine's rumble grew from a murmur to a roar, that building crescendo of power that always seemed barely contained. Jennifer reached over and squeezed Marcus's hand. Their ritual, the small gesture that said, "I'm here and we're safe and this will be fine." He squeezed back, not looking up from his screen, and she smiled. The acceleration came suddenly, pressing them back into their seats, the ground blurring past the windows until it fell away entirely, and they were climbing, the earth dropping below them in a patchwork of browns and greens and the silver ribbon of highways. The seatbelt sign remained illuminated. The flight attendants stayed buckled in their jump seats, and for 10 minutes everything was exactly as it should be. Then Apollo stood up. It wasn't a normal movement, not the stretch and shift of a dog getting more comfortable. This was instant, urgent, his entire body going rigid as he rose to his feet in the small space between Marcus's legs and the seat in front of him. Marcus felt it immediately and pulled out one earbud, looking down. Apollo's gaze was laser-focused down the aisle toward the back of the plane, and a low whine was building in his throat, not aggressive, not yet, but deeply distressed. Marcus's hand went to the dog's head automatically, that soothing touch that usually calmed any anxiety. But Apollo didn't respond. He took a step forward, straining against the space constraints, and the whine grew louder. Jennifer noticed now, leaning forward to look past her son. Several passengers were turning to look, their expressions ranging from curious to annoyed. A service dog acting out was unexpected, slightly scandalous in the way any disruption of social norms tends to be. Jennifer felt heat rising in her cheeks, the particular embarrassment of being the center of unwanted attention, and she reached down to help Marcus calm Apollo. But the dog was having none of it. He pushed forward again, more insistently, and now the whine had transformed into a series of sharp, urgent barks that echoed through the cabin like gunshots. People were definitely staring now. A man 2 rows up turned fully around in his seat. A mother with a baby looked alarmed, clutching her child closer. And from the back of the plane, Jennifer saw a flight attendant unbuckling and starting toward them. her expression somewhere between professional concern and barely concealed irritation. This wasn't supposed to happen. Apollo had flown dozens of times without incident. He was certified, trained, tested. He didn't just act out, but he was acting out now, with an intensity that was beginning to frighten Jennifer, because she could see in the dog's eyes that this wasn't misbehavior, this was purpose, this was alarm, this was Apollo trying desperately to communicate something that his human companions were failing to understand. Marcus was talking to Apollo in a low, steady voice, trying every command he knew. Sit, down, settle, easy. None of them worked. The dog had moved fully into the aisle now, his body blocking the narrow passage, and he was staring with absolute fixation toward the back of the plane. His hackles had risen, that instinctive bristling that made him look larger, more threatening, and the barks had taken on a deeper, more guttural quality. The flight attendant reached them, her professional smile strained. She knelt down beside Marcus, her voice pitched to be soothing but firm. "Sir, I need you to get your dog under control. He's disturbing the other passengers." Marcus looked up at her, and Jennifer saw something in her son's face that stopped her breath. Not embarrassment, not confusion, but a dawning realization. "He's alerting," Marcus said quietly. "He's trained to alert me before seizures, but this is different. This is—" He stopped, his gaze following Apollo's line of sight. "This is his danger response. Something's wrong." The flight attendant's expression shifted, confusion replacing irritation. "Danger? What kind of danger?" But before Marcus could answer, Apollo lunged. It happened so fast that Jennifer barely processed it. One moment the dog was in front of them. The next he was tearing down the aisle past startled passengers who jerked their feet and legs out of the way, his eyes locked on a target that was now horrifyingly clear. Seat 12F, the man by the window. Apollo reached the row, and without hesitation, without any warning, he launched himself at the man with such force that both the businessman in the aisle seat and the elderly woman in the middle scrambled away, pressing themselves against the opposite side of the plane. The man in 12F had nowhere to go. He was trapped against the window, and Apollo was on him, teeth bared, snarling with a ferocity that Marcus had never seen before, never imagined his gentle companion was capable of. The entire plane erupted into chaos. People were shouting, someone screamed. 3 flight attendants were converging on row 12, and Jennifer was frozen in her seat, one hand covering her mouth, watching her son's service dog, the dog she'd trusted with Marcus's life, apparently attacking a passenger for no reason at all. But there was a reason. Marcus knew it with a certainty that cut through the panic like a blade. He was unbuckling his seatbelt, hauling himself up using the seat backs, pulling himself down the aisle with his arms while his legs dragged behind him because his wheelchair was gate-checked, and there was no time at all. His mother was shouting at him to stop, to stay seated, but he ignored her. Apollo was still snarling, still pinning the man, not biting him, Marcus noticed, not actually hurting him, but keeping him immobilized with sheer intimidating presence. The man's face was white with terror, his hands raised in surrender or protection, and he was babbling something incoherent. The lead flight attendant had reached them now, a tall woman with iron-gray hair and the bearing of someone who'd handled every possible in-flight emergency. She was reaching for Apollo, preparing to pull him off, and Marcus felt ice flood his veins. "Don't!" he shouted, his voice cracking with urgency. "Don't touch him! Check the man first. Apollo doesn't react like this unless there's danger." The flight attendant paused, her hand hovering over Apollo's collar, and in that split second of hesitation, everything changed. The man in 12F made a sudden movement, his hand darting toward the backpack he'd stowed under the seat in front of him. Apollo's response was instantaneous. He snapped forward, not at the man, but at the bag, grabbing it with his teeth and yanking it out into the aisle. The bag fell open, contents spilling across the floor, and what tumbled out made every person within view go absolutely silent. Pill bottles, dozens of them. Prescription bottles with labels that clearly didn't belong to the man. Names like Sarah Chen and Robert Martinez and David Kowalski printed on the pharmacy stickers. And beneath those, wrapped in what looked like a child's T-shirt, something else. Something that made the flight attendant's face drain of color. She reached down slowly, carefully, and pulled back the fabric. Inside were bundles of photographs, the kind of photographs that couldn't be described, couldn't be acknowledged, the kind that made the flight attendant immediately close the bundle and look up at the cockpit with an expression of pure, cold horror. She grabbed her radio. Her voice, when she spoke, was utterly controlled, despite the tremor Marcus could see in her hands. "Captain, we need to return to Denver immediately. We have a situation, and we need law enforcement waiting at the gate. Now, before we go any further, I want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop your country or city in the comments below. And if you're not already subscribed, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications because you won't want to miss what happens next. This story is about to take a turn that nobody on that plane could have anticipated. The man in 12F was talking now, a desperate stream of words tumbling over each other. "I can explain. This isn't. You don't understand." But the flight attendant wasn't listening. She'd signaled to her colleagues, and within seconds they'd formed a barrier between the man and the rest of the passengers. Apollo had released the bag, but remained positioned. Between the man and the aisle, his body tense, ready to react if the man tried to move. Marcus had reached them now, dragging himself the last few feet, and he positioned himself next to Apollo, one hand on the dog's back, feeling the rapid hammer of the animal's heart under his palm. The dog was still on high alert, but he leaned slightly into Marcus's touch, that eternal connection between them, holding steady even in the midst of chaos. Jennifer had followed her son down the aisle, her face streaked with tears she didn't remember shedding, and she knelt beside Marcus, wrapping her arms around him while trying to make sense of what was happening. The captain's voice came over the intercom, steady and calm, announcing that they were returning to Denver due to a security situation, that everyone needed to remain seated and calm, that law enforcement would meet the aircraft. The plane was already banking, turning back toward the airport they'd left less than 30 minutes ago. The next 20 minutes passed in a strange, suspended state. The man in 12F had stopped protesting, had gone completely silent actually, his gaze fixed on the floor, while two flight attendants stood guard over him. The elderly woman who'd been sitting next to him had been moved to a different seat, and she kept looking back with an expression that cycled between confusion and horror as she realized what might have been sitting next to her. Other passengers were whispering, speculating, some of them filming on their phones despite the flight attendant's requests not to. Marcus stayed in the aisle next to Apollo, refusing to move even when his mother tried to convince him to return to his seat. The dog had calmed somewhat but remained vigilant, his eyes never leaving the man, and Marcus understood with a clarity that made him feel years older than 13 that Apollo had just done something extraordinary, something that went beyond his training, beyond his certification as a seizure-alert dog. Apollo had detected danger, real, terrible danger, and had acted to protect not just Marcus, but potentially every person on that plane. The specific nature of that danger was still sinking in, still too awful to fully process, but Marcus could see it in the flight attendants' faces, in the way they wouldn't quite look at the man, in the tight set of the captain's jaw when he emerged from the cockpit to assess the situation. The plane touched down with a slight bump at 8:47, exactly 56 minutes after takeoff. They taxied not to a regular gate, but to a remote area of the tarmac, where Marcus could see through the windows a cluster of vehicles waiting, police cars, unmarked SUVs, an ambulance standing by. The seatbelt sign went off, and immediately the lead flight attendant was on the intercom, her voice firm and commanding. All passengers remain seated. I repeat, remain in your seats. Law enforcement will be boarding the aircraft and will provide further instructions. The cabin door opened, and what seemed like a dozen officials flooded in. Airport police in uniform, FBI agents in suits, and bringing up the rear. 2 officers with a detection dog of their own, a Belgian Malinois who immediately began sniffing through the plane. The man in 12F was escorted off first, his hands now zip-tied behind his back, his head down, and as he passed Marcus's position, Apollo let out one final, low growl, a sound of pure contempt that needed no translation. Then the officials were talking to Marcus, to Jennifer, to the flight attendants. They were gentle but thorough, asking questions, taking statements, examining Apollo's certification papers. One of the FBI agents, a woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, crouched down to Marcus's level. "Son," she said quietly, "your dog may have just helped us close a case we've been working on for 8 months. That man is wanted in 3 states. We've been tracking him, but he kept slipping away. However he knew—" She glanced at Apollo with something approaching awe. "He knew, and he made sure we couldn't miss it." The full story emerged slowly over the next few hours, though some details Marcus and Jennifer would never learn were never meant to learn. The man had been traveling with stolen prescription medications, opioids mostly, that he'd been acquiring through a network of pharmacy robberies and fraudulent prescriptions. But that was almost incidental compared to what else he'd been carrying. The evidence stored on a hard drive buried at the bottom of his backpack alongside those photographs. Evidence of crimes that the FBI agent wouldn't detail, but that made her expression harden into something implacable when she spoke about it. He'd been moving between states, using commercial flights, because he'd calculated that a middle-aged man on a domestic flight drew less scrutiny than other forms of travel. He'd been careful, methodical, and he might have made it through this flight, too, might have disappeared into whatever city he was headed toward, if not for Apollo. The agent explained that while service dogs were trained for specific tasks, seizure alert, mobility assistance, PTSD support, some of them developed an almost uncanny ability to detect things beyond their formal training. Stress hormones, the chemical signature of fear or aggression, changes in behavior too subtle for humans to consciously register. Apollo had somehow detected something wrong about the man. Maybe a scent, maybe a behavioral cue, maybe something science couldn't fully explain, and had refused to let it go. By the time they were finally cleared to leave, it was early afternoon, and the airport was buzzing with rumors about what had happened on the flight. News crews had set up outside the terminal, though airport security was keeping them at a distance. Jennifer had called her sister, had tried to explain in a voice that kept breaking what Marcus and Apollo had done, and was now working with the airline to arrange new flights home. Marcus sat in a quiet corner of a private waiting area the airport had provided. Apollo pressed against his side and tried to process everything. His hands were shaking slightly. The adrenaline crash, his mother had said, perfectly normal after what he'd been through. But it wasn't just adrenaline. It was the weight of realization, the understanding of what might have happened if Apollo hadn't alerted, if they'd ignored him, if those photos and that evidence had made it to wherever the man was going. Marcus buried his face in Apollo's fur, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady rise and fall of his breathing. "Good boy," he whispered, his voice muffled. "Such a good boy." Apollo's tail thumped once against the floor, but otherwise he remained still, letting Marcus hold on to him for as long as he needed. The story made national news by that evening. Not the full story. The FBI kept many details sealed, but enough. "Service dog alerts to dangerous passenger on flight," the headlines read, accompanied by photos of Apollo that Jennifer had provided, his official service dog portrait showing a noble, alert German shepherd with intelligent eyes. The airport released a statement commending Marcus and Apollo for their actions. The airline offered them complimentary flights for a year, an offer Jennifer accepted with weary gratitude. And suddenly, Marcus's phone was flooded with messages from friends, from distant relatives, from strangers who'd somehow gotten his contact information, all wanting to congratulate him, to praise Apollo, to hear the story firsthand. It was overwhelming and exhausting and more than a little surreal. Marcus had never wanted to be famous. He'd spent most of his life trying to be normal, to not be defined by his disability or his need for assistance. And now here he was, the subject of news stories and social media posts. The boy with the hero dog, as one outlet had called him. He didn't feel like a hero. He'd just listened to his dog. He'd trusted Apollo when everyone else thought the dog was misbehaving. That was all. But as the days passed and more information came out, information carefully curated by investigators, but enough to paint a picture, Marcus began to understand the magnitude of what had happened. The man had been linked to multiple crimes in multiple states. His arrest had led to further arrests, a network being systematically dismantled, and all because Apollo had caught a scent, had sensed something wrong, and had refused to back down even when it would have been easier to dismiss him. The FBI agent called Jennifer a week later to thank them officially, and to ask if Marcus and Apollo might be willing to visit the agency's training facility, to meet with their own canine unit, and perhaps share insights into how Apollo had been trained. Marcus had agreed immediately, excitement cutting through his lingering exhaustion. In the meantime, life was slowly returning to normal. He'd gone back to school, where he was treated as a minor celebrity for approximately 3 days before his classmates moved on to other concerns. He'd returned to his routine, homework, physical therapy, time with friends, hours spent with Apollo. The dog seemed completely unaffected by his newfound fame, approaching each day with the same steady focus and loyalty he'd always shown. There was a ceremony a month later. The local police department, in coordination with the FBI, held a formal commendation event where Apollo was awarded an honorary medal for valor. Marcus wore his nicest clothes and tried not to fidget, while officials gave speeches about courage and instinct and the remarkable bond between humans and animals. Apollo wore a new vest for the occasion, dark blue with patches indicating his expanded recognition as not just a service dog, but as a verified detection asset. When it was Marcus's turn to speak, he wheeled himself up to the podium, Apollo at his side as always, and looked out at the crowd of reporters and officials and curious onlookers. He'd prepared something, had practiced with his mother, but when he opened his mouth, different words came out. "Apollo isn't a hero because of what he did on that plane," Marcus said slowly. "He's a hero because of what he does every single day. He keeps me safe. He gives me independence. He makes my life better just by being in it. What happened on that flight? That was just him doing what he always does, protecting me, protecting the people around me. That's who he is." His voice cracked slightly on the last words, and he reached down to touch Apollo's head. The dog looked up at him with those dark, knowing eyes, and Marcus smiled. That's who he's always been. In the aftermath, there were discussions about expanding service dog training, about researching how animals might be utilized more effectively in detection and security roles. Apollo became something of a case study. Scientists wanted to understand how a dog trained specifically for seizure alert had demonstrated such remarkable threat detection abilities. But the researchers who examined Apollo's history and training came back with conclusions that were both fascinating and humble. Apollo, they said, was simply an exceptional dog with exceptional instincts, paired with a handler who trusted him completely. The training had given Apollo skills and discipline, yes, but what had happened on that plane went beyond training. It was instinct. It was the product of millions of years of canine evolution that had developed an ability to read threats and protect their pack. Apollo had identified Marcus as his pack, had expanded that protection to include Jennifer, and in that moment on the plane had apparently decided that every passenger aboard was under his guardianship. It was remarkable. It was extraordinary. And it was, the researchers noted with some frustration, almost impossible to replicate with any reliability. You couldn't train a dog to do what Apollo had done. You could only hope to find dogs with that innate capacity and then give them the skills to act on it. Marcus sometimes thought about the man in seat 12F, wondered what had become of him, though Jennifer had gently suggested that dwelling on it wasn't healthy. The legal proceedings were ongoing and would likely continue for years. Marcus would probably never know the full extent of what had been prevented that day, but he knew enough. He knew that Apollo had sensed evil. There was no other word for it, no matter how anthropomorphic it might sound, and had acted to stop it, and in doing so, had probably saved lives. Maybe not lives on that plane specifically, but lives that would have been destroyed by whatever the man had been planning, whatever evidence he'd been carrying. It was heavy knowledge for a 13-year-old to carry, but Marcus found that he could carry it, that it didn't crush him the way he'd feared it might, because he didn't carry it alone. Apollo was there, always there, a warm presence at his side, a guardian who asked nothing in return except maybe an extra treat now and then and a good scratch behind the ears. And really, Marcus reflected, that was what service dogs did at their core. They carried burdens that would otherwise be unbearable. They distributed the weight. They made the impossible possible. The story could have ended there with commendations and news coverage and a return to normalcy. But there was a coda, a final note that occurred 6 months later when Marcus and Jennifer received a letter. It was from a woman whose name they didn't recognize, and when Jennifer opened it and began reading, her hands started to shake. The woman identified herself as the mother of one of the children whose photos had been in that backpack, whose exploitation had been part of the network the man in seat 12F had been involved with. She'd learned about Apollo through the news coverage, had followed the story, and she wanted Marcus and Jennifer to know something. She wanted them to know that because of that arrest, because of the evidence seized and the investigation it had sparked, her daughter had been recovered, had been brought home, was safe now, finally, after 2 years of nightmare. The woman didn't go into details. Marcus was grateful for that. But she made it clear that the domino effect that had started with Apollo's actions on that plane had led, through investigation and cooperation between agencies, to her daughter's rescue. "Your dog is a hero," she wrote in handwriting that betrayed how hard the letter had been to compose. "But more than that, he gave me back my baby. There are no words for that kind of gratitude. I hope you know, I hope Marcus knows, that what happened that day mattered. It mattered more than you could possibly understand." Jennifer read the letter aloud to Marcus that evening, while Apollo dozed at it, their feet, and by the time she finished, both of them were crying. Not sad tears exactly, but the complicated kind that come from confronting the reality of how much pain exists in the world and how much difference one moment of courage can make. Marcus reached down and ran his hand along Apollo's back, feeling the steady warmth of him, the simple physical presence that grounded everything. "She got to go home," he said softly, and it wasn't a question, just a statement of wonder. Jennifer nodded, wiping her eyes. They sat in silence for a long while after that, the three of them, as the evening light faded outside, and the house settled into its familiar nighttime rhythms. And Marcus thought about chains of events, about how one person's actions rippled outward in ways you could never predict or measure, about how Apollo's decision to alert, his refusal to back down, had set in motion a sequence that had ultimately brought a child home to her mother. It was almost too much to comprehend. But it was also, Marcus realized, exactly what service dogs did every single day on a smaller scale. They changed lives, they prevented disasters, they stood between their handlers and harm. Apollo had just done it on a larger stage, in a way that couldn't be ignored or dismissed. Life moved forward, as it always does. Marcus grew older, started high school, dealt with all the usual challenges of adolescence compounded by the unique challenges of navigating the world as a wheelchair user. Apollo stayed by his side through all of it, steady and unwavering. And if the dog sometimes got recognized in public now, if people occasionally stopped to take photos or thank him for what he'd done, he bore it with the same patient dignity he brought to everything else. Marcus and his mother kept the letter from the woman whose daughter had been recovered, kept it in a drawer where Marcus could take it out and read it when he needed a reminder that individual actions mattered, that paying attention to the right things at the right time could change everything. And on the anniversary of that flight, Marcus took Apollo to the park and threw a ball for him for an hour straight, until the dog was panting and happy, and flopped down in the grass, with his tongue lolling out. "You're a good dog," Marcus told him, scratching behind his ears, while Apollo's tail thumped contentedly. "The best dog, and I'm sorry I ever doubted you even for a second." Apollo licked his hand, unconcerned with apologies, focused only on the moment, the sunshine, the grass, the presence of his person, living, as dogs do, entirely in the now. The final truth, the one that Marcus carried with him into adulthood, the one that shaped how he thought about trust and instinct and the bonds we form with those who protect us, was this: Apollo had saved lives that day, not because he was exceptionally trained or because he possessed some supernatural sense, but because he'd been trusted, because when every human instinct had said the dog was misbehaving. Marcus had chosen to believe there was a reason, had chosen to listen instead of dismiss. That was the real lesson of that day, the one that mattered more than any commendation or news story. Trust the ones who love you. Listen when they're trying to tell you something, and understand that sometimes the most important voices are the ones that don't use words at all. Apollo had spoken that day in the only language he had, through action, through insistence, through an absolute refusal to be ignored, and Marcus had listened. Everything else had followed from that single moment of trust. Years later, when Marcus spoke at schools and community centers about service dogs and disability awareness, that was what he always came back to. Not the dramatic rescue, not the national news coverage, but the simple, profound importance of paying attention to those who dedicate their lives to keeping us safe. The world is full of Apollos, he would tell his audiences, dogs and people both who see danger, who sound alarms, who refuse to stay quiet when something is wrong. Our job is to listen. Our job is to trust them even when we don't understand. Because sometimes, in that trust, lives are saved. Sometimes, in that moment of listening, everything changes. And sometimes, the greatest act of heroism isn't the dramatic intervention. It's the quiet choice to believe that someone who loves you might know something you don't. That was what Apollo had taught Marcus, and it was a lesson he would carry for the rest of his life.